Hello everyone, we will continue our discussion on the topic Ichnology, Ichnofabric and Ichnofacies. In the previous class, we discussed about the concept of Ichnology and Ichnofabric, and as I told you earlier, in this class we are going to discuss about another aspect of Ichnology, that is the concept of Ichnofacies. So, Ichnofacies, these are much bigger in terms of their concept, in terms of their appearances when we compare them with respect to the Ichnofabric. So, when we talk about Ichnofabric, they are about individual sedimentary units or a package of sedimentary units in much smaller scale, whereas Ichnofacies are much larger and they are in terms of the depositional environment. So, Ichnofacies are basically the recurrent combinations of sedimentary facies and trace fossils. So, in one sedimentary environment or in one part of the sedimentary environment, we can get several facies types, facies associations, and we get some characteristic trace fossils present within those facies. So, together this will produce one ichnofacies indicating a particular depositional condition or a particular sedimentary environment. So, there are several ichnofacies names like Scolitos. Scolitos is the name of one ichnoform as well as Scolitos is the name of Ichnofacies. Similarly, Cruziana, Zoophycus, Neriites, these are the names of different Ichnofacies. I will give you a brief idea about these different types of Ichnofacies and what is the advantage of or the use of this particular Ichnofacies concept in terms of sedimentological interpretation and sequencestatic interpretation that we will try to discuss over here. So, commonly the Ichnofacies concept was derived with respect to the marine ichnoforms, and majority of the Ichnofacies initially were derived for dominant marine environments. So, depending on the substrate condition in different marine environments, different Ichnofacies were defined long back by scientist Seliger in 1967, and then it was modified and several other Ichnofacies were introduced to cover the other types of ichnoforms. So, later on we get Ichnofacies defined from continental part also, we get Ichnofacies from the marginal marine part, we get Ichnofacies formed in firm ground condition, we get Ichnofacies from hard ground condition and also on the wood ground condition. Now, the point is, what is the meaning of Ichnofacies? We can take one example from here. This is a very traditional diagram, very common diagram used to represent different Ichnofacies. Say for example, there is an Ichnofacies called as Scolitos. As you can see, it is indicated into the environment called sandy shore environment. So, what is the condition we expect in sandy shore environment? It is a high energy zone where high energy currents are there, high energy waves are coming in, and dominantly we get sand deposits, medium to fine grained sand, sometimes maybe coarse grained sand. So, in such condition, organisms, definitely their numbers will be much less and they will not be deposit feeders, because on the surface the energy condition is quite high and organisms will not like to prefer that high energy condition. So, what they will do? Organisms will try to go down the substrate within the sediments and they will try to thrive over there, making home. So, majority of the trace fossils in that condition will be vertical burrows, where the organisms will make vertical columns and at the bottom of the column they will be thriving and they will be collecting food from the suspension feeding mode. So, what kind of organisms we expect over there? Mostly this kind of vertical burrows, like this is example of Scolitos burrow, these are some example of Arenicolite, maybe some Diplocratidian, like this. So, there are several names, several ichnoforms, and we try to identify them or classify them in terms of their genus name and species name, as we do in case of normal biological naming or in terms of paleontological naming. Similar kind of systematic descriptions are also available for all these different forms. So, in this particular class or in this course, I will not go into that detail, but when we are talking about the Scolitos Ichnofacies, it is giving us a primary idea or primary picture about the energy condition. So, it is a high energy condition where dominantly sand is getting deposited, and in that sand depositing condition we are getting dominantly vertical burrows, and since this is a high energy condition, loose sands are present. So, these vertical burrows will be looking for some stability, and that stability is commonly provided by making some wall along the burrow. So, if this is the burrow structure, say this is the vertical wall from this substrate, then the organism will try to make a vertical wall along this burrow so that sand does not collapse into this, because the organism is thriving over here somewhere in this depth. So, definitely if the structure collapses, the organism will die. So, to prevent that, to provide stability into this structure, organisms make some wall by themselves, maybe by using some mud along this boundary, or maybe just adhering the sand grains by secreting some kind of material from their body, which acts as a cementing material for these sand grains over here, and they together make a hard wall, which does not allow loose sands from this zone to collapse into this structure. So, we get this kind of vertical burrows with some wall structure, commonly mud walled or this kind of agglutinated walls, and they will dominantly produce this kind of suspension feeding organisms thriving within this kind of burrow. So, dominantly the dwelling burrows. On the other hand, if we look into another form called zoophicus, as you can see, it is indicating much deeper part of the ocean. So, definitely here the energy condition is much low, supply of sediments is dominantly mud, not sand, maybe little bit of sand may come intermittently under some high energy, maybe some storm is bringing some sand into this part, or maybe some turbidity currents are bringing some sand over here. Otherwise, this area is not getting any sand supply. Overall energy condition is very low, oxygen condition is quite low. So, under that condition, we get some other type of organic activities. First of all, the nature of organisms will differ and their behavior are completely different. So, there is no question of instability of the substrate, because this is a low energy zone, mud depositing condition. So, organisms do not have to make their vertical burrow, and they are getting the supply of food on the substrate. So, they will thrive on this substrate, or maybe they can use the sediment little bit to get the nutrients. So, most of the burrows will be concentrating on the surface, they will not go down. So, mostly we will get surface grazing forms, surface dwelling forms, mostly the deposit feeders. So, in this case the nature of burrows will be completely different, and when we call zoophicus ichnofacies, it indicates this kind of condition in terms of energy, in terms of sediment supply, and in terms of organic activities. So, this is the use of ichnofacies, this is the application of ichnofacies. So, looking at one ichnofacies, we can straightway get idea about the broad energy condition, about the dominant organisms which are present, about the substrate condition, and also about the behavior pattern of the organisms. So, in that way we define several ichnofacies. So, these are some examples. Scolithos ichnofacies, dominantly sand, material wise, substrate wise dominantly sand, soft ground. All the burrows are vertical burrows, and there we get this kind of lining, or some of the burrows may be this kind of U-shaped burrows, some of the burrows may be this kind of U again with some internal lamination, we call them as spritel lamellae, or we can get this kind of vertical burrows, and when they go to the depth, they can be interconnected, there can be branching. So, we get all these types of burrowing structures in the Scolithos ichnofacies. As per name, these kind of structures are called as diplocraterium, these kind of structures are called as arenicolites, these are the Scolithos burrows, these may be the spongyliomorpha burrows. So, this is actually the assemblage of different ichnoforms, but they are forming in one particular condition by different organisms or maybe by same organisms. So, when we are talking about the Scolithos ichnofacies, it is actually indicating this condition, the energy condition, the type of organisms, their mode of life form. Similarly, if we talk about the Nereids, there is a very low energy zone where dominantly mud is getting deposited over there. So, all the burrows you can see over here, they are all horizontal forms, they do not have to go down the substrate. So, we are getting this kind of grazing form, this kind of grazing form, this kind of grazing form, or this kind of locomotory forms. So, these are mostly or dominantly feeding burrows, sometimes they are Pasichnia, grazing forms, and they indicate a very low energy condition. So, definitely the organisms will also vary. The nature of organisms over here for the Scolithos and the nature of organisms over here will be different. Similarly, if we look at the hard rock. This is an hard rock. So here what we are getting is a boring. So we are getting organisms making this kind of hole within the hard rock. So this is a hard ground ichnofacies called as trypanite, where we get this different type of borings. So when we are getting a boring, this is an erosion basically. As you can see in this diagram, this is an erosion. So materials are removed from there and organisms can come down over here and stay over there. So trypanite, another ichnofacies indicating hard ground condition, indicates completely different kind of condition in terms of substrate, in terms of energy, in terms of the conditions, and in terms of the organisms which are responsible for making this kind of structures. So very briefly, I will try to give you a broad spectrum of different types of ichnofacies. We can divide them into major types based on the substrate. So first of all, we can get some non-marine ichnoforms, and dominantly they are soft ground in nature. For example, in the non-marine part, that is within the continental part, we can get termiticnus, we can get squenia, we can get murmia. So these different names of the ichnofacies, they are actually indicating different conditions in the continental part. So within this kind of ichnofacies, several trace fossils are present. For example, in squenia, we can get different vertebrate tracks. Also another form called as squenia, one ichnoform called as squenia, that can be present. When we are talking about murmia ichnofacies, there can be murmia, one ichnoform, gordia, one ichnoform, planolites, one ichnoform, similarly paleophycus, similarly vagoricnus. So these are the different ichnoforms which may be present within murmia ichnofacies. And when I am talking about murmia ichnofacies, it indicates a freshwater condition, it is a completely aquatic, shallow to deep lake condition, and it is a soft ground condition. When I am talking about squenia ichnofacies, it indicates commonly the alluvial conditions, alluvial flat plains, where different organisms make trail marks or different types of tracks. Similarly, depending on the substrate condition, we can get some other type of ichnoforms which may vary from marine to non-marine condition, or maybe in the marginal marine condition. One type is called as pteridolite ichnofacies, which basically indicate wood ground. That means this particular ichnoforms, they try to burrow within wood. Wood is the substrate. So very commonly we can get this kind of structures in the estuaries, in the deltas, in the incised valley fields. Similarly, in the marginal marine part, we can get another ichnofacies called as silonicnus. So silonicnus is a soft ground marginal marine ichnofacies which commonly form in the backshore part, sometime in the foreshore area as well, and these are commonly formed by the crabs. So silonicnus ichnofacies, they indicate again a particular condition in the marginal marine area where soft ground condition, dominantly sand, because in the backshore we get sand dominantly, loose sand which are not adhered, even dry sand, even they are not wet. So there we get different types of crab burrows which are interconnected with each other, and they can form different forms like silonicnus, Mecanopsis, etc. Similarly, we can get hard ground condition where we get trypanite ichnofacies. In the last slide I have shown you. So trypanite again form in marginal marine to marine condition. They can range from foreshore to shore face to self environments, and there we get again different types of ichnoforms under this trypanite. For example, trypanites itself, we can get entobia, etc. And another important type of substrate condition is the firm ground condition, where the substrate is partly consolidated. We call them as firm ground condition. They are not soft ground, they are not hard ground. They are intermittent between soft and hard ground condition. We call them as firm ground condition. And the characteristic ichnofacies in this firm ground condition is glossy fungites. So glossy fungites again form in the marginal marine to marine condition. Starting from foreshore to shore face to shelf, we can get glossy fungites in tidal flats, we can get glossy fungites in estuaries, in deltas, wherever this kind of firm ground can form. Mostly whenever we get some mud dominating and it is getting exposed for some time, then it becomes firm ground. Similarly, we can get firm ground condition in carbonate depositing condition also. So what kind of ichnoforms we get within glossy fungites? Very commonly we can get thalassinoids, a very common ichnofossil. We can get rhizocorallium, we can get diplocraterium, we can get scolithos, we can get aridicolites. So you can see many of these names are repeating. Scolithos ichnofacies can have scolithos ichnoform, as well as again the scolithos ichnoform can occur within glossy fungites. So, what matters is the association of different ichnoforms and what is the substrate condition. So, when I am getting a scolithos associated with thalassinoid and within a firm ground, we will call them as a glossy fungites ichnofacies. But when we will get a scolithos formed in soft ground condition, dominantly sand, indicating high energy condition, and it is associated with some other forms like arenicolite, like diplocratirium, then we call them as scolithos ichnofacies. So, it will indicate a foreshore to shore face condition, completely marine system, and it is a soft ground ichnofacies. So, within soft ground ichnofacies, particularly when we are talking about the marine part, because non-marine we have already discussed. So, in the soft ground marine ichnofacies, we get dominantly 4 different types: scolithos, zoophycus and neriites, starting from shore to deeper part. So, scolithos is in the foreshore to shore face area, lower shore face to inner self area, zoophycus outer self to slope area, and neriites slope to basin floor area. Though we are designating a particular environment, say for example neriites, we are saying slope to basin floor condition, basin floor environment, but it is not necessary that neriites will only form in the slope or basin floor area. It is more about the energy condition. So, even if in the tidal flat area, if we get say completely mud depositing condition, very low energy condition, locally we can get neriites ichnofacies over there as well, because it is about the condition, depositional condition, about the supply of nutrients, about the oxygen supply, and about the organisms which are thriving in that particular condition. So, initially this concept of ichnofacies was developed with bathymetric control. This ichnofacies concept, it was dependent on the bathymetric distribution, the depth wise distribution of these different ichnoforms. But nowadays it is related to the energy condition of the depositional system. If the energy condition is very low, even in a very shallow condition, we can get neriites ichnofacies. Even in a deeper condition, we can expect some other form like cruziana. So, it may vary. But when we are looking into an ichnofacies, broadly it will give us an overview about the depositional condition, about the substrate condition, about the overall assemblage of different ichnoforms which actually portray the type of organisms, nature of organisms and their behavior pattern. So, definitely there are several usefulness of studying ichnotaxa and the ichnofacies. They indicate the overall environmental conditions. So, looking at ichnofacies and studying individual ichnotaxa within those ichnofacies, we can straightway interpret about the conditions prevailing in the depositional environment. We can interpret about the relative sedimentation rate, as I have already told you in the previous class, that whenever we get some rapid sediment deposition, it contains relatively fewer trace fossils, whereas if it is a slow depositional process, then within a thinner sediment layer we get more ichnoforms, more dense ichnocolony. Study of the ichnofacies help to show whether the sedimentation was continuous or marked by some erosional breaks, because as there will be an erosional break, it will be associated with some other condition, and under that other condition some other ichnoforms will be forming. Ichnofacies, they provide a record of the behavior patterns of many extinct organisms. In the previous class, I gave you one example of trilobite trace. So, trilobites are extinct now, but looking at those traces which are preserved in the rocks of Cambrian age, we can get very vivid idea about the behavior pattern of the trilobites, which is a very important clue to reconstruct the paleoecology, also about the organism's life conditions. Many times the ichnofacies help us in measurement of paleocurrent, because some of the ichnoforms, they may form oriented with respect to a particular current direction. Maybe if the current is flowing and the organism will like to protect itself from the current, dominant current direction, so it may get inclined like this. So, when it is getting inclined and all the burrows in that particular system are getting inclined in the same way, that can be used for paleocurrent analysis. Many times mud walled burrow may act as obstacle to the current, and they can produce obstacle marks like current crescents, and when this kind of current crescents are formed, they can be used for paleocurrent analysis. Due to the shape of the burrow systems, many of them are very typical in nature. So, they demarcate the top and bottom orientation of sediment beds. For example, I have shown you the sketch of Diplocratidion, which is an U-shaped burrow with some spritel lamellae. So, that U-shaped burrow is very typical. It can be very easily used to understand what is the top direction, and they can be very effectively used in deformed terrains to understand the stratigraphic top. Since we are dealing with organisms and we know that different organisms, they have thrived on the earth surface for different time span. Again, I will go back to the trilobite example. So, trilobite, they were existing on the earth for a particular time span. So, looking at those particular ichnoforms which may indicate a particular time span with respect to particular organisms, we can use them for biostratigraphic and chronostratigraphic significance in terms of defining some biozone or some correlation purpose. Again, we can take the example of dinosaur tracks. So, definitely they have certain range. We cannot get a dinosaur track today. If you are getting dinosaur tracks preserved in certain rocks, we can use them straightway for correlation purpose or identification of the biozones. Many times we can use the ichnofacies for recognition of discontinuity surfaces within stratigraphic successions, as across this kind of discontinuity surfaces the conditions of deposition greatly vary, and when this kind of variation is occurring, it will definitely lead to change in the ichnoforms, their ichnoassemblages, and definitely there will be a change in the ichnofacies. So, when we try to demarcate this kind of boundaries, we can do that using some soft ground related ichnofacies which generally form in conformable successions, and they help in the interpretation of paleodepositional environments. And if there is a sudden change in that assemblage, in that association of ichnoforms and the host facies types, we can interpret about some changes in terms of maybe some sea level change, maybe in terms of some other changes, allogenic or autogenic factors, which may lead to some transgression and regressions may have occurred with respect to time. So, we can use the soft ground related ichnofacies for interpretation of such transgression, regression related changes in the sediment record. Also, we can use some substrate controlled ichnofacies which are genetically related to some stratigraphic gaps, stratigraphic hiatus, and they help us to identify the unconformities in the rock record. So, these are some references that you can go through for further reading. In today's class, we have tried to understand the other aspect of ichnology. We have tried to understand the concept of ichnofacies. We have tried to understand the different types of ichnofacies. We have tried to understand the differences between the substrate controlled ichnofacies, hard ground, firm ground, soft ground ichnofacies, and how they can be used for different interpretations, how they can be used in sequence stratigraphy also. So, thank you everybody.